Identifying. We can now turn to the subject of identifying. At this time there is cause to reflect upon that state of being called identifying. We all have to struggle against being identified, and to resist life. We can thus begin by asking the question, where do we place our feeling of I? It is like placing the voice. Where we place the feeling of I most mechanically, is where we will tend to most identify. If we were able to place the feeling of I fully in self-remembering, and all that it means, then we would not identify. But this is conscious placing, because no one can self-remember mechanically. To remember oneself is a conscious act, a conscious placing of I, requiring attention to begin with. So let's then consider attention. When we are paying attention, are we identified? Begin with inner identifying. A person may be fully identified with their inner state. They may be depressed or afraid, hurt or angry, frustrated and so on, then simply be in this state. Then our feeling of I and our state are one and the same thing. This is inner identifying. The person is identified with themselves, their feeling of I is placed in their prevailing mood. Supposing though that they observe their state, which requires attention. We all know that attention puts us into more conscious parts of centers. One can understand therefore that no one can observe themselves mechanically. They may of course imagine that they are observing themselves, but they are not, and are therefore learning nothing new about themselves but simply turning in a circle, chasing their own tail. In fact, mechanical self-observation is an important mental habit to be observed. So we can ask this question again. When we are paying attention, are we identified? To answer this question with regard to inner identifying means that when we are identified with our inner state and observe it, are we still fully identified? How can we be? In the work we all have a very powerful instrument available to us called non-identifying. But how long does it take for any of us to see what this means and to begin to use it? If a person is always identified with their inner state of the moment, with their thoughts and their moods, then they cannot change. For a person to shift from the position they are in, they must first divide themselves into two. That is, they must be able to observe their state, from the position of the observer. If they are their state, then nothing can take place. If they divide themselves into an observing side and an observed side, becoming two, then they begin to be able to shift their position, to change internally. Understanding this idea is the way out of the prison of oneself. With regard to being identified with life, take as first example this: if we are paying careful attention to the horses in a race, one of which we have backed, are we identified? The answer is both yes and no. Insofar as we are paying attention, we are not identified. Inasmuch as we are anxious that our horse should win, we are identified, and so cannot pay attention. The two states, the state of attention and the state of being identified, struggle with one another. Take a second example: if we are in a great hurry to get an important letter finished, then we are identified. But if after many abortive attempts, we find it necessary to attend carefully to what we are writing, then we are not identified while in this state of focus. Although we may remain identified as it were, in the background, in mechanical parts of centers we may still be identified. But since we have had to move into more conscious parts to write the letter properly, while in them, we are not identified. In these examples, the individual is conscious within mechanicalness. So let's note that it is also possible to be mechanical within consciousness. Speaking then in general, about the state of being identified with life. What is life? This question is not posed in a philosophical or theoretical sense, but in a practical sense. Life is a series of events on different scales. It is not things, people or objects, but events that bring these things and people and objects into different relations with us at different times. This is the fifth dimension, created through conscious will, by choices and decisions we have made in every moment. The pen on the table is not an event itself, but becomes part of a small event when we decide to pick it up to sign a check. In this event, the pen, the checkbook, the table, the ink, and ourselves, the person to whom we make out the check, are all suddenly connected together. This is an event. Next moment, the pen, the checkbook, and so on, fall as it were apart, then lie silent and motionless. Our water faucet is not an event to us except when we take a bath, or unless it leaks. Our bed is not an event, unless we go to bed or sit on it. A nail may lie on our mantelpiece. This is not an event. Suddenly, we want to hang a picture. Then the nail gets caught up into an event. Our neighbor next door may be a person unknown to us. They are not an event. But we overhear that they have called us a fool, and suddenly an event between the neighbor and us takes place. The leaves lie motionless on the ground in autumn, and suddenly a whirlwind comes, then they become part of an event. An event gathers things together, moves them about and passes. Consider the world event of a great war. This is an event on the scale of humanity. The countries of Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and the rest of Europe are not events in themselves, but when war suddenly descends like a whirlwind, and turns them around and around, bringing them violently into a certain relationship with one another, then this is an event. War gathers people together, moves them about, and when it has passed, the objects, the things of war, the people, all fall apart and the survivors will go home. If we begin to study life as events, what we are really studying is the law of three forces, which says that every manifestation is the result of three forces. A thing in and of itself is not an event, unless it conducts one of the three forces in a triad. And any thing or person can conduct one or other of the three forces at different times, and so be differently related to a particular event. Reflect upon what this really means. There is a stick and there are two people. There is no event. They are merely three things. Then the two people quarrel, and one hits the other with the stick. All are now conducting the forces of a triad, and a manifestation takes place, an event unfolds in the fifth dimension. We open an old cupboard and see an ragdoll. It was once involved in many small events. Now it is simply a raggedy thing. We shut the cupboard door and it there remains simply a thing, involved in no event. To summarize briefly, life can and should be seen as a whole series of events unfolding in the fifth dimension, as a result of conscious will applied to objects in a particular moment. Not as things and people, as mere visible objects of the third dimension. We as things, are caught up by a particular sort of event, which forms or creates an outcome. If we can see this, then it is an act of attention to do so, and makes it possible not to identify with the outcome as much as we often do. All events recur. There are only a certain number though, which is whatever remains on the level of the sixth dimension. All possible events on earth were created with man was created with his life, with all the events possible to happen to us, which is what makes up the sixth dimension. Events are on different scales. So ask yourself, what event am I in? And am I totally identified with it? This puts you in attention and prevents you from being so identified with the event. Life keeps us asleep, and draws all our life force, our conscious will from us, by a number of well-worn events with which we are always identified. This makes us feel tired, exhausted, and saps our energy, wasting it on being identified and eroding the ability to create for ourselves. To mold our own fate and become masters of our destiny. It takes away the power of choice, in any given moment. Life keeps us asleep, the sheep of the magician, and draws from us all of our life force, by a number of well-worn neural pathways with which we are always identified. And so everyone must enter as if afresh, should pass through as many as possible of these different shows and sideshows of the great circus on earth called life, so as to have plenty of material on rolls in centers, a wealth of depth and plenty of experience to draw from. As otherwise the necessary contrast between life and this work is not possible, because a person who knows nothing of real life, sees little difference between it and the work, and so has no basis of contrast or tension of opposites in them to create friction and heat the retort. They take life and the work on the same scale. If we draw back internally, from whatever event that we are identifying with in life, then try to formulate the event and say to ourselves, this is called being blamed for something I did not do. This is called losing one's temper. This is called being insulted. This is called being overlooked. This is called losing something. This is called being disappointed. This is called being in a mess. This is called being late. If we can do this, then we will not identify as much and understand that these are simply outcomes, the result of events and things coming together, being acted upon by forces which create them in the fifth dimension. Everything else possible in that moment remains existent in the sixth, and can be brought about by further events. Only things possible though, for an elephant cannot fly and $1,000 will not fall from the sky and land on our living room carpet when we have spent the rent money, and the landlord is knocking on the front door.